Most leaders don't avoid difficult conversations because they don't care. They avoid difficult conversations because they've not been taught how to do them well. In today's episode, we are going to cover a framework to help you have those difficult conversations. But before we do that, let's look at why, for example, having performance based conversations can be quite difficult for us as managers and leaders. Generally, they're difficult because they are important. They might stir or create a bit of anxiety or overwhelm because we know that there can be a lot on the line when we're sitting in having these conversations. I often like to say that your relationship with your team members, especially when you engage with them on a one-to-one basis, it's never static. That relationship is either getting stronger or, unfortunately, if you don't handle that conversation well, that relationship is obviously going to be diminishing in things like trust. So, what do we need to know as leaders before we head into those conversations? Well, I often talk about this idea of our thrive versus our survive cocktail. And if we think about it for a moment, a survive cocktail generally looks like a body and brain that is flooded with adrenaline and cortisol. This always on syndrome where we're never taking a break and we're moving from one task to the next. The reality for most of us in the working world is this is how we are operating. But if you imagine heading into a conversation where both that's your internal state and that's the internal state of the individual you're sitting down with, you can see how, without an appropriate framework, these conversations can go awry very, very fast. So what we want to be mindful of is creating what we call that thrive cocktail in the other individual. This is where we are doing things and saying things which is going to produce increases in dopamine, oxytocin, and endorphins in the other individual. And very quickly, let's talk about what puts those things under threat or what might increase that survive cocktail. A model I like to use comes from Dr. David Rock in the book Your Brain at Work, and it's called the SCARF model. And essentially, what Dr. David Rock talks about is these 5 psychological needs that when they are not met, we generally feel threatened as an individual and we will disengage in those difficult conversations. And those 5 elements are status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. So as I head into that difficult conversation, I need to be aware of how potentially those 5 psychological needs are now under threat. If we take the example of the performance conversation, the performance feedback conversation, it's very easy to see, okay, when I sit down with this individual, am I potentially, or could they feel that their status is under threat? Well, of course they could. So what could I do as I enter into that conversation to help that individual? And as part of our framework, we're going to look at 3 things that we should do before we start into those conversations. And we're also going to look at 3 key things that we should do when we are in those conversations. So the 3 things that you need to focus on before you head into this conversation. First is you've got to be considerate of how you can make that environment psychologically safe. And one key tip here would be simply sending an email to the individual before the conversation, giving them an outline on the topic of the conversation. I'm often struck by how many leaders and managers will schedule a one-to-one without actually giving any insight into the agenda. The second key point before the conversation is be very clear on what you want and need your outcome to be. So in the case of a performance feedback conversation, what improvements specifically do you need to see from that individual? And the last piece is around mastering your stories. So I could create a story in my mind that this individual is slacking off, without actually giving them an opportunity to give their side of the story. It's really important in order to remain calm and to promote more of that thrive cocktail between both parties, that you master your own stories before you move into that conversation. Now we're in the conversation. What are the key things we need to be mindful of? Well, the first is that you always start a difficult conversation with the facts, with the objective data. If I start that conversation with how I perceive the situation, that is one way to escalate the temperature within that room very, very quickly. So be really mindful that you are starting that conversation with objective data and you're starting with the facts in that situation. Then what you can do after you've actually provided that data is you can now begin to talk about the impact. So you can now bring in your perception, maybe the impact it's having on you as the leader or the team, or maybe the business as a whole. You're starting to tell your story, but you cannot do that before you've provided the facts in the situation. The next piece is to remain open as you're moving through the conversation. So when you are giving your suggestions, they are exactly that. They are potential suggestions. You are not speaking in a way which is really essentially saying this is what you have to do. And that feeds into the next piece of that conversation. So you're remaining open, and then you're moving to exploring the other person's point of view using quality open-ended questions. I often see leaders fall down in this area by asking closed questions like, does that make sense? Again, if we're not eliciting the feedback or the perspective of the other individual, that individual is going to walk away from that conversation feeling like it was one-way traffic, and that they now, if we think back to our SCARF model, their level of autonomy now has been completely undermined. And what that will do is it will leave in their mind doubts around aspects like certainty and fairness. Is that leader dealing with everybody the way they've just dealt with me? So we need to be able to create an open dialogue, exploring that person's perspective by asking quality questions. Think about being a coach in this situation. So you've shared your facts, you've given your story, and now you want to put your coach's hat on. And there are a couple of things we can do when we have that coaching hat on. The first one is be sure to mirror what you're hearing and seeing. So don't be afraid to call out if you see that the individual maybe is getting a little frustrated with where the conversation is going. You can actually call that out to reduce the temperature and the intensity within that conversation. The second piece is paraphrase. So when you're asking your open-ended questions, you're paraphrasing back to the individual to ensure that they feel that they are being heard and there's a level of clarity now. My leader, my manager understands me. And the last skill I would recommend when you've got the coaching hat on is to prime the individual. And what I mean by that is if they are hesitant in coming forward, that's where you might say, I could be wrong here, but this is what I'm seeing, or this is how I feel this could play out. But again, you're finishing with an open-ended invitation to get their perspective. The last part of this conversation, which is crucially important and often gets left out, is making sure that we move to action. So we've overcome the difficult emotions, we've utilized our framework, and then sometimes what happens is we go on our way without concrete actions. So at the end of that conversation, we want to be very clear on who is doing what, by when, and when we are going to follow up. So in our example of the performance feedback conversation, you've identified the objective data. You've had a back and forth discussion, and now you're very clear on what you want to see and when we are going to check in on that. And I would also ensure that that's followed up with an email. In closing, it's important to note that these conversations, are not easy. But it is a skill that we can develop, and it's a necessary skill if we are to be effective as a leader. My challenge to you is to start to utilize the different elements of the framework we covered today, the elements we do before the conversation, and the elements we can then implement when we are in that conversation. And that practice over time will help increase your effectiveness as a leader. Thank you.